and the presentation this evening will shine a light on their stories and ensure their names are not forgotten. We will have some time after the presentation to answer some questions, so feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A feature, and we'll get to as many as we can. So with that, I am so pleased to introduce our friend, Donna Ray Pearson.
Good evening, Joy, and thank you. I do have a PowerPoint tonight, so you'll just have to bear with me 1 second while I pull it up and get everything going. All right. Even though I can't tell, I'm hoping everyone can see the screen. In this presentation, I normally do this in person, so this feels a little weird to do it online, so you guys will have to bear with me a little bit, okay? But I'm going to go ahead and get started. You know, for too long, the Brown versus Board of Education case has been remembered as a fight led by men in suits. But the truth is, the case is titled Oliver Brown et al. v. Board of Education of Topeka et al. Now that et al. Listed after Brown signifies 12 seemingly ordinary women living in Topeka, Kansas. They also played a crucial role in this landmark victory. These mothers agreed to be plaintiffs pushing for equal access to educational opportunities for all Black children, not just their own. Today, I will tell you about the case and answer the question, why Kansas? Then I will fill in at least some of the blanks of the lives of these 12 women that were part of the case of the century. I'm sure the question was asked before it appeared in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and again in the Topeka Capitol in December of 1953 editorial. The Topeka Capitol characterized the words the editor wrote as pertinent ancient history. He stated that the 5 champions of segregation were South Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, the District of Columbia, and Kansas. He then implored, why Kansas? A couple of paragraphs into the article, he states, beyond that, however, Kansas was founded as a state on the belief in equal rights. Before the Civil War, the slavery question was fought out in bloody Kansas. No state better symbolized the conviction of the North. Why is Kansas now defending segregation? In the article, an unnamed state official said that the end of legal segregation wouldn't change much, that Kansas would abide by the old theory that education might be separate but equal. Oh, and then we move the slide. Sorry about that. The Topeka Capitol. All right, we are having problems tonight. Let's see. The Topeka Capitol concluded the shades of Governor Robinson and Jim Lane and other Jayhawkers of a century ago would revolt at this theory. It was not whether Kansans could stand for segregation or they had their officials even asked them. Now, let me remind you of how we got to have the case of the century in our state. In 1874, when the Kansas legislature passed a Civil Rights Act prohibiting discrimination on account of race, colored, or previous conditions of servitude that applied to schools and public institutions of all levels, to common carriers, and to places of public accommodations in entertainment licensed municipalities. With this act, living up to the promise of Bleeding Kansas era. But then in 1879, the largest migration of Blacks out of the South happened. The reputation of Kansas had gained as a place of equal rights was guaranteed, attracted some say up to 40,000 Blacks to the state between 1879 and 1881. The migration is called the Exoduster movement. At one point in time, nearly every county in Kansas had a Black population, which is, as we know, is not necessarily the case today. But in response to this migration, white Kansans did a lot of things. Blacks were provided shelter. They received help locating jobs, and in some places, they also were receiving education. I do have to mention that there were just as many Blacks that came with their own resources to begin a new life. Here in Topeka, I live in Tennessee town, and because as a researcher, I just did a random research project, and I wanted to know how many of the Blacks in Tennessee town and came of resources, so I decided to look at building permits, and it turned out the majority of that colony actually came, bought their land, and started building. So it's not monolithic in nature in that all of them didn't come with resources. And the Kansas legislature responded as well. It passed a statute specifically allowing first-class cities, those with at least 15,000 or more, to conduct separate elementary schools. The cities that could have what we call permissive segregation were Atchison, Leavenworth, and Topeka. By 1950, this list would grow to 11 cities across the state. Now, looking at this from a national level, by 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson upheld the separate but equal doctrine in the United States Supreme Court. Homer Plessy argued segregation on trains violated the federal Constitution's 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. However, the court ruled 7-1 that it was separation wasn't inherently unequal if the facilities were equal. This decision validated racial segregation for decades prior to the Brown case. But even before the Plessy decision, Black Kansans opposed permissive segregation laws. From 1881 to 1951, Black Kansans would file at least 17 cases, 11 Kansas Supreme Court cases, and 6 known lower court cases for the right of their children to attend school with equal resources and opportunities available to white students. Now, to get an example of what this is, we can just look at this map from school segregation in Kansas in the 1950s. And basically what it explains is how depending on where you were and what part of life you were in, you had what racial segregation laws you had to abide by. So the Kansas Board of Regent University schools, all of those in green, you allowed integration in there. But the first class cities, which also sometimes contained a university, and those are the blue stars across the state, that's where school segregation was allowed by the 1950s. And actually there were some second and third class cities that came up with, they were very creative and came up with different ways to create a segregated school system that just kind of snuck into the laws. So, and those numbers on there refer to the times that there was some sort of case that challenged the segregated public schools in that county. Now, the one thing that, I always like to point out is that Hutchinson was and that's why it gets a little yellow heart. Hutchinson was the only city in the state that could have had segregation, but opted not to do it. So this all just highlights that there was a choice in this matter. Now, what this shows is on the national level, a graphic image of segregation. So those blue states, again, where optional segregation could happen. And those states are we think of are in the North and in the West. And we typically don't think of those states being as ones that would allow segregation of any kind, especially, but you see, we are bordered by 2 states that allowed mandatory segregation, but then we are also bordered by Colorado, where segregation was forbidden, and Nebraska, where there was just no legislation whatsoever. So again, we had a choice in this matter, and we had laws on the books at this point in time, initially, that also prohibited segregation, promised equal access. So that's what's kind of interesting about why Kansas, but there are other reasons too. When answering the question of why Kansas, we have to consider Jim Crow. Though you hear the words Jim and Crow frequently, I think when we look at them together and define them as a pair, we come up with some different meanings. Based on the minstrel show character Jim Crow evolved into a derogatory slang term for Black people. Eventually, it came to mean any state law passed, especially in the South, that established different rules for Blacks and whites. Jim Crow laws were based on the theory of white supremacy, basically, and were a reaction to the Reconstruction period. And most people don't realize it, but Jim Crow lived a pretty good life in Kansas. Now, there were probably not any signs hanging in windows that I've ever seen. If someone had seen them, please let us know and where they were hanging at, actually. But in general, in Kansas, as a Black person, you would just have to know where you could go. Now, here are some of the things you would just have to know if you were in Kansas that you could do, because Kansas practiced something called de jure segregation, segregation imposed by law, and they also practice de facto segregation, which is a practice even when it is not required by law, meaning there was no law prohibiting or letting something happen. It was just by tradition or by culture. Most of the things that I'm getting ready to list are referring to public spaces. So if you were Black in Kansas, you most likely were not going to be seen in public eating with whites, trying on clothes or shoes in a store, living in white neighborhoods, swimming in city pools, going to a white hairdresser, going to a white dentist, sitting in church with white churchgoers, riding in a railroad car with whites, renting an apartment if one white lived in the building, teaching white children, being embalmed by a white undertaker, going to school with whites, or being buried in a cemetery alongside with whites. So as a result of Jim Crowism, it was in these segregated spaces that Blacks frequently created their own separate communities that did not rely on contact with whites. In these communities, you would find Black businesses, Black doctors, Black nurses, Black churches, Black cemeteries, etc. These were the social networks that gave Black people space to have discussions and strategize about ways to make their lives better. Now, things were about to change. World War II put America prominently on the international stage. The link between white supremacy and Hitler's master race theories just couldn't be ignored anymore. Jim Crow shocked the United Nations delegates who reported this practice home and reported this practice back home. Racial discrimination furnishes the grist for communist propaganda mills, said one government spokesperson. It raises doubt even among friendly nations as to the intensity of our devotion to the democratic faith. All right, so let me take you back in time for a second. In 1951, Lucinda Todd most likely sat at her dining room table with a pad of lined paper and a pencil. It was here that she began to draft a 4-page press release that stated, "For the Negro Press." Next line. "Suit hits separate schools in Kansas." Next line. "Topeka, Kansas." Next line. Quote, "Legal counsel for a group of Negro children who, through their parents, are seeking to enter grade schools located in the area which they live, have filed an amended complaint in a lawsuit filed in the U.S. District Court of First Kansas District on February 28th. All of the plaintiffs live here. The statute, which gives cities of Kansas the right to establish separate schools, is being challenged in this case." From there, she explains the causes, tells who the attorneys are filing the actions, the reasons why they filed the lawsuit. Near the end of the press release, she writes, Interest in this case is widespread, and some educators are predicting an end to segregation in Kansas schools. She goes on to recall the success of integrating the junior highs in Topeka that led to integration of junior highs across the state. The suit she is talking about is Oliver Brown et al. V. Board of Education of Topeka et al. It was filed by the Topeka NAACP on February 28, 1951. The plaintiffs were 13 Topeka parents on behalf of their 20 children. The case listed the 13 plaintiffs as Oliver Brown, Darlene Brown, Lena Carper, Sadie Emanuel, Marguerite Emerson, Shirley Fleming, Zelma Henderson, Shirley Hodison, Maud Lawton, Alma Lewis, Iona Richardson, and Lucinda Todd. These Black women are the et al. After Oliver Brown's name. Let's then move them to the forefront. Who were they and what did they do? And I am going to actually read their bios to you. So just one second. Darlene Brown was born in Crowburg, a mining camp in southeast Kansas in 1926. Brown is a child of Andrew Magnolia Phelps and is their only offspring. At the time of the case filing in 1951, Brown was self-employed hairdresser and the youngest adult plaintiff. Her primary connections in the community were through the Baptist Church, where she was a member of Mount Carmel Baptist Church. Brown was involved in various activities at the church, including serving as the choir director, organist, and pianist. She continued to reside in Topeka until her passing in 1997. Lena Carper was born in 1920 to George and Catherine Greer in Hiawatha, Kansas. She grew up and attended school in Hiawatha before relocating to Topeka, where she worked at the NYA Center. She participated in the New Deal work program implemented by Franklin Roosevelt, and it is possible that she may have met other plaintiffs that were also participating in this program as well. She married Dorsey Carper in 1940, and during the time of the case, she worked in nursing homes and did housework while Dorsey was a department manager at the Hotel Kansan. Later in life, she may have worked as a seamstress or in clinical child care for the Children's Hospital at Minneker's Foundation until 1983. Later, she played a vital role in forming the Church of God Seventh-day Adventist Church. She spent the rest of her life in Topeka and is buried in Mount Hope Cemetery in 2002. Sadie Emanuel was born in Huntsville, Alabama, to a family of 5 children. She moved to Topeka in 1924, around the age of 8. She married Lawrence Joshua Emanuel sometime before 1940. She had one son, James Meldon, who was 9 at the time of the first trial. Sadie worked part-time as a cook at the local hospital and served as the president of the Washington PTA. And the Washington PTA was the largest Black school in Topeka. She was also the chair of the church wagon at the Carver YWCA and was a member of St. John's AME Church, where she was a member of the choir. Shirley Fleming was born in a small town of Winfield, Kansas in 1914. She was the 5th child of James and Ella Wilhoit. When she was 15 years old, her entire family moved to Topeka. Shirley had 5 sons, 2 of whom were from a previous marriage to Thomas D. Phelps. By 1940, she married Silas H. Fleming Sr., a butcher. Together, they had 3 sons. These 2 sons, Dwayne D. and Silas H. R. Jr., were the infant plaintiffs in this case. After the Supreme Court case was decided, the family moved to Minnesota. Unfortunately, not much is known about her life there. Shirley passed away in 1968 at the age of approximately 53. Marguerite Emerson was born on September 19th, 1919 in Topeka. to Fred and Helen Harris. In 1940, she married George Emerson, and she worked for the railroad during the case, but it is unclear what Marguerite's occupation was during the trial. But it is possible her connections to the trial came from her neighbors. She lived a close proximity to the plaintiffs, Iona Richardson and Lucinda Todd, while their children all attended Buchanan School. Later in life, Marguerite worked for the state of Kansas, where she retired. She attended Mount Carmel Missionary Baptist Church along with fellow plaintiff Darlene Brown, where she remained a member until she passed away in 1979. She is buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery. Zelma Henderson was born in Colby, Kansas. Zelma Henderson attended integrated schools. When she moved to Topeka in 1940, she was shocked by the level of segregation and could only get a job as a maid. Instead, she attended Kansas Vocational School and later operated a beauty salon out of her home after her marriage. There, she sold NAACP memberships to her clients. Henderson was the first with friends with Topeka NAACP President McKinley Burnett, whom she had known through her mother. She was asked by attorney John Scott to join the case. She did so because I did not want them, her children, to have any type of inferior feeling about the other race. Shirley Hodison was born in 1922 in Indiana. By 1944, she had moved to Topeka and was married to Charles Hodison. They had 5 children, including Charles, who attended Buchanan School at the time of the 1951 filing when he was 8 years old. Shirley was a housewife and went to live in California, where most of her children resided upon the death of her husband. She died there in 1997. Maud Lawton was born in Cowado, Oklahoma in 1907. It is unclear when she arrived to Topeka. At the time of the case is filed, she is a housewife living with her family at 1422 Munson. She was a member of the Capital City Community Church of God and entered as a plaintiff in the Brown case on behalf of her daughter, Victoria. Alma Lewis was born Magdalene Alma Payne in Independence, Kansas, to Richard and Matilda Payne on March 15, 1914. It is unclear when she moved to Topeka, Kansas, but the 1930s census lists her as a resident in her household of her father. Charles was a veteran and worked as a custodian at the Veteran Building during the case while Alma was a homemaker. She remained married to Charles upon his death in 1959. She remarried. Alma was a member of the First Church of God in Christ, where she may have come to know Iona Richardson. Later, she became a member of Faith Temple Church of God in Christ. She lived in Topeka until her late husband's death in 1992. She then relocated to Portland, Oregon with her children until her death in 1998. Iona Richardson was born the 5th child of William and Elizabeth Ware in Wisconsin. Her mother, Elizabeth Martin Ware, was a member of the Stockbridge Indigenous Tribe of Wisconsin. All 8 children, including Iona, belonged to this tribe as well. Her father, William, was a Black American. Iona's husband, James, testified their son, Ronald, attended a parochial school instead of a segregated public school simply because I do not believe in segregation. Richardson lived a few doors away from Lucinda Todd's house. She attended the First Church of God of Christ. At the time of the case, Iona was a homemaker. Later, she worked for Forbes Air Force Supply Depot. She lived in Topeka for the rest of her life until she passed away in 2000. Vivian Scales was born in 1911 to James and Anna Ella Wilhoit in Winfield, Kansas. Her family relocated to Topeka, Kansas in the early 1930s. She is the younger sister of fellow plaintiff Shirla Fleming. They both were used to integrated schools in Winfield before they moved and attended the public schools in Topeka. Vivian married George Scales in 1939 and represented their only child, Ruth Ann, in the case. She remained very active in the community, including the NAACP, where she may have been introduced to the other plaintiffs. In regard to the case, she once stated, "It wasn't easy, but it was something you had to want to do. If it would do anything at all, it would be better." Vivian remained a dedicated member to Antioch Baptist Church until she passed in 2005. She was buried alongside her husband at Mount Hope Cemetery. Lucinda Todd was born in a small coal mining camp called Litchfield, Kansas in 1903. Her parents had been part of the post-war exodus from the South into Kansas. She founded the Citizens Committee on Civil Rights in 1948. Todd wrote a letter to the National Branch Office of the NAACP stating that her daughter did not have equal access to educational opportunities that the white children had in Topeka. Todd was the first parent to register as a plaintiff. She held many positions in the Topeka branch of the NAACP. Todd passed away in 1996 in Topeka. Now, these 12 women represent a wide range of experiences. They were the typical Black women of 1950s. During this time, they were all married and they obviously all had children. The research team, and just to give a shout out to the research team, there were 3 of us, all of us were women, and we all decided to do this. So we each took 4 women and did as in-depth of research as we could. So, and part of what we wanted to do was put together a new image of these women to hopefully let you get to know them a little bit better. Now, most of their husbands had good jobs. For a Black person in Topeka, Darlene and Sadie's husband both worked at the railroad. Sherla and Zelma's husbands worked for a meat packing factory. Lena and Shirley's husbands worked at hospitals. This might have afforded these women a certain amount of status in the community. Now, after World War II, most white women returned home after the factory work for the war was done. Black women were in the workforce before the war and after the war. They were helping their families obtain a middle-class status in the community. I would also like to point out that at least 3 of them, Darlene Brown, Zelma Henderson, and possibly Lena Kerper, owned their own businesses or at least took in work. A couple of them had husbands that had stable enough employment that they were able to stay home. So now I also found their age range kind of fascinating. The youngest one, Darlene Brown, she was only 25 years old. The oldest one was Lucinda Todd. She was probably around her 50s while the case was winding its way through the judicial system. I think I always love to get a shout out to Darlene because we don't expect this kind of behavior today from a 25-year-old, someone who's willing to put their lives, to put their reputation, to put everything on at stake to become a plaintiff in a case like this. Of course, they didn't probably know it was going to blow up the way that it did, but still, I appreciate Darlene for that. Now, what was also interesting was their educational background. Now, we found that at least 5 of them were born in rural areas across the state of Kansas. So if you remember what I said, most likely if they were living in a city of less than 15,000 people, that means they probably attended some form of an integrated school, either at the upper or lower levels. This would have played into part of the reason why they wanted to be a plaintiff, because this would have shaped their worldview as to what opportunities were available for them. So for most of them, except for Lucinda Todd, we actually could not verify how much education they had, which, whether it's right or wrong, we concluded that they were probably not educated beyond the junior or the high school level. We do suspect that the business owners either went to KTI or maybe they went to Kansas City and attended the Madam C.J. Walker School to learn cosmetology. So remember, as a response to segregation, Blacks built their own communities that had institutions such as the social ones, political ones, spiritual ones, and economic ones. But it's in these segregated spaces, these women were able to hone their leaderships and organizational skills, all on account of Jim Crow. Now, the research team found that they all participated in some sort of mainstream religious organization. So what does that mean? Or how does that translate? Well, if you have ever volunteered for any kind of church function, like a pastor's anniversary or something like that, you're going to learn lessons in recruiting, leadership, fundraising, planning, and they use all of these skills, when the Brown case happened. They were also able to have closed meetings in supportive environments when they participated in women's clubs, such as the Las Senoritas Club, the Colored Parent Teachers Association meetings, the NAACP, and they were even participating in sorority meetings. So, and also we looked at, where they were living. Because of neighborhood segregation in Topeka, they were neighbors and their children or their grandchildren were playing together. And if you notice, I mentioned that some of them were related to each other. We found these family relationships. These women were most likely sitting together at holiday tables. And as these connections were it's through these kind of connections where it would have been easy for one to ask the other to recruit the other through the committees. So now we have to think about that the civil rights movement and Black women activists were taking shape much earlier than the 1950s. Topeka was the site of many firsts for Blacks in Kansas. The first local unit / branch of the NAACP was formed in 1913, and there was actually one woman holding the office of secretary. The Topeka Council of Colored Women's Clubs was made up of multiple clubs, 3 of which were founded in 1898. In 1900, those clubs joined the National Association for Colored Women's Clubs that was founded in 1896. Now, this umbrella organization advocated for women's rights as well as the uplift to improve the status of African Americans. Its focus was on community service, charitable work, and reform. This including the focus on healthcare, temperance, and voting rights, as well as education and racial inequality. I'm sure it was this backdrop of community support that made these women say yes when asked by Lucinda Todd and the others on that special NAACP committee they put together to recruit families. Now, what was their acts of resistance? Now, their very first act of resistance was attempting to enroll their children in the nearest white schools. We don't know the stories. We don't know all the stories of their attempts, but it's the simple act of a white person rejecting their children at the door had to either make them feel one of 2 ways. They probably either felt defeated or 2, motivated to continue moving forward with this endeavor. I'm sure they probably also had to have more than one serious conversation with their loved ones before signing up to be plaintiffs. In addition to signing their names, the majority of them also testified at the local trial. Lena Carper was the first to offer testimony along with her daughter, Catherine Carper Sawyer. They testified about things that only a mother responsible for their child could testify to. The lawyers asked the women questions about the dangers of their children getting to school, the inconvenience of the busing system and its long waits, the safety hazards some of their children experience, the wasted time traveling far distances to the nearest Black school. After the trial, they did have a few encounters with the media. As activists, they had to stand firm in their convictions when the Black community did not always necessarily support their case. Though the 12 women plaintiffs were the focus of this research project, I do want to give a mention and a shout out to some other Kansas women or close to Kansas women that contributed to the success of this case as well. Lucille Bluford was a publisher and editor of the influential African American newspaper, the Kansas City Call. She was also an earlier plaintiff at a school segregation case herself. As a newspaper woman, Bluford played a vital role in the fight for educational equality. Although it's based in Kansas City, Missouri, Bluford was a tireless advocate for desegregation, and she actively supported and reported on the lawsuits taking place in Kansas. And then someone gave me a pass, including Bluford, because she actually attended KU. So you know us, if you live in the state for a little while, you're ours. So there's that too. Now there is Esther Brown, a resident of Merriam, Kansas. She played a pivotal role in the 1940s lawsuit challenging racial segregation in that small town. She was often referred to as the white Mrs. Brown to distinguish her from Oliver Brown, of the Topeka case. She was instrumental in the fight for educational equality in Kansas. She helped found the NAAC branch in Merriam. For that case, she also helped promote the case and raise funds for it. Her activities were documented by Lucille Bluford. Lucinda Todd most likely read about them in the Call. Todd said that the Topeka Brown case could not have been won without Esther Brown. Fayetta Sawyer is a Black woman who lived in Topeka, and I feel like she was probably Lucinda Todd's right-hand woman. The two were known to go door to door, gathering signatures for petitions. They also did fundraising together. Sawyer and her husband both supported equal opportunities for Black children's education, and they both participated in efforts to enroll Black children in white schools. There's one more that, okay, I really can't claim Pauline Murray to Kansas in any way, but she is important to note. Marshall's federal strategy is based on a college paper written by Pauline Murray. In this paper, she determined the best strategy to desegregate would be to a direct attack on Plessy versus Ferguson decision. She and her theory actually turned out to be right. It was utilized. So when the case was decided in 1954 in Kansas, about 8,000 Black children attended segregated schools. The first class cities were Kansas City, Topeka, Lawrence, Salina, Atchison, Coffeyville, Fort Scott, Leavenworth, and Parsons. The second and third class cities practicing segregation were Baxter Springs, Bonner Springs, Chitopa, Manhattan, Olathe, Oswego, Paola, and Elwood, which is actually a third class city. While changes didn't happen instantly, these children and all future children's lives would be changed by these women's actions. The women of Brown had influence beyond Brown et al. V. Board of Topeka court case. By taking these first steps to the white school, they began the process of dismantling the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of 1896, which had codified separate but equal, and began the process of paving the way for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. With this impressive achievement, why was a research project needed to reclaim them? The reason why they were lost to history is really complex, but the bias plays a big part of it. It is bias in the media. They were never really asked a lot of questions, but as researchers, we could see their voices slowly fading away over time in the documents. The bias in community memory played a part in it. Not all in the Black community were in favor of the case. Though they didn't speak of it badly in mixed public spaces, there was concern of its impact on the local Black community, especially the Black teachers. Also, there was a need to clean up the image of Kansas. Somehow the need for a local lawsuit and then the need for a federal Supreme Court judge to mandate integration for some reason has been overshadowed by the fact we are, quote, the case of the century that integrated the world, and it happened in this state. But we have forgotten the very reason why this case happened here: segregation, Jim Crow. The biases make sure that the women, especially Black women's accomplishments, are minimized or overshadowed by the men involved in the case, and ultimately being close to erased from the public record. Their tireless work as educators, club women, and mothers sustained the movement's momentum. Though their leadership roles were often downplayed or just outright ignored, Black women's unwavering determination and fierce commitment to justice should be remembered. Their legacy is a powerful testament to the transformative power of activism. So with that, let's talk about it. And I will stop sharing my screen. And I got back to you, Joy. That's amazing.
Wonderful. That was amazing, Donna Ray. We
Thank
do have
you.
some questions coming in.
Okay.
First of all, Mary says, great job. And she asks, did any of the plaintiffs face any violence?
To my knowledge, I don't believe they were ever physically assaulted. I do know when you look in Lucinda Todd's collection of papers, and there's a couple of newspaper articles where she received threatening letters. So I don't know if anyone actually went through with assaulting her in any way. So, but yes, yeah, people could pick up a pen really easily.
Okay, and Bob asks, how did Lucinda and or the NAACP approach any men to be part of the case besides Oliver Brown?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And there is no direct evidence as to whether there were men involved. There is one thing to note: at the local level, there were actually 3 men that testified as opposed to the women. So, and I think part of the reason why they testified is because at the local level, it was about equalization of resources from the school as well as their tax dollars. So if the men were the taxpayers of the house, that's why they needed to testify. It was just a legal strategy. So, but when you look at a book called A Girl Stands by the Door, there's an overwhelming number of women involved in school desegregation. So I believe part of the reason they needed just at least one guy to sign up to show that this wasn't just a woman's fight.
Very good. Okay. Would you like to speak a little bit about how you started researching the women of Brown?
Yeah, yes, I can. You always got to have a research strategy, especially when it's such a daunting topic. Women's history, Black history, and you combine women and Black history together, it's going to be a little bit more challenging. So we decided to keep it simple. The first thing we looked for was their obituaries, and we figured their obituaries would identify so much information. One, it's probably going to be written by a relative, and it will be a recalling of their lives. So we found many of them, we found out, where they were born, when they were born, who their parents were, how many siblings they had, if they had kids, what kind of church they went to or other civic activities they were involved in. And that worked for about 90% of them, but there's always a couple, right? So, but once we located them, then we also used census records to verify the information, city directories as well, also verified information. Then we really started digging deep and using newspapers. And sometimes we got lucky. Sometimes we were able to find a descendant that was willing to talk to us. And so we got information that way as well. And then just tried to compile it all.
Wonderful. Okay, Barbara asks, I understand that many Black teachers unfortunately lost their jobs when the schools were integrated as a result. Can you comment on this?
Yes, I can. It depended on where you were located. From what I could tell, some of the other cities, like Parsons and I believe Leavenworth, yes, they did have an impact and started losing their Black teachers and they never regained footing. Now, Topeka actually did start the process of integration about a year before the actual case decision. So what ended up happening was, and this is also the baby boomer time period. So let's keep that in the back of our brain. There's an abnormally a lot of kids in the school system right now. So some of the yes, some teachers left. Some teachers did, were fired. I can think of what happened in Topeka. There were 6 untenured teachers that got fired, but because of the overwhelming demand and need for teachers, they were rehired within a year. Now, the Black schools, because of the way Topeka approached integration, the model they used is that Blacks had an option of continuing to go to their Black school or transferring to a white school. I don't know if it happened the other way around. I don't know if any white students ended up going to the Black schools. I haven't seen any evidence of that, but so there was an impact on the teacher and it varied according to location, basically.
Okay. Well, this has all been very interesting, Donna Ray. Thank you for your time and all of your good research on this topic. We're so happy you were here with us tonight. I hope everyone will join us again next month, Wednesday, June the 12th at 6:30 p.m. to hear Merle Riedel present A New Generation of Veterans, Stories from Iraq and Afghanistan. So from all of us here at Museum After Hours, thank you so much for joining us and have a great evening.
Thanks, Joy.